Alright, so now we're at episode 20. Oh, Death, where is your sting? Not a long intro. Not a long intro. I'm glad Anakin didn't die. I'm wondering, because some of you still have not figured out how to put stuff in the comments that lets me know things are coming. Who's in the cell with him? In any case, here we go. Don't spoil things! This sounds like it's going to be bad.
The sound of the rifle was muted, the rain more than masking the rasp of the round being loaded into it and locked into place. Not that the Calambian marksman was anywhere near enough to an enemy to be overheard. "O Death, where is your sting? O Horus, where is your victory?" said Joseph, the words of his faith flowing freely under his breath as his grim work was done. He sighted down the powerful scope, lenses kept religiously clean by his care and rewarding him with a crisp and clear line of sight on the replique soldiers who guarded the three-legged walker tanks. They had yellow markings over their white armors and held what looked like flamers and melta-guns. "The sting of death is but sin, and the strength of sin is the law of the Xenos," he whispered, eyes searching. He held more of the large rounds between his fingers, even as he used his arms to brace and aim the massive rifle. When the time came, the enemy would not know him as a sniper. They would know him as Death, as the orcs had known him, as the Tyranids had before them.
Nice.
Joseph came from a long line of marksmen, and they had refined their skills to the point of obsession. Even now, Joseph expected, his son Ezekiel was back with the rest of the Calambian tugs and conveyors, being seen to a new home, assembling and disassembling his rifle, all the while dreaming of the day he could drill in earnest once more. But Joseph pushed thoughts of his son and family down, keeping his focus on the words of the Akasha and on his search for his target. He found it only a few seconds later, hovering near the back lines on some kind of floating sled. The massive tank that these flame troopers were using to reload and refuel their weapons.
Here comes an oof.
The sniper felt his lips quirk slightly. He had been uncertain that he'd be able to spot it from his current position, low as it was, but smothered his enthusiasm as soon as it flared up. The Founder only condoned the taking of Xenos life, and, say what you will, these replicae were human. Their deaths were a tragic necessity. He aimed his sights for the center of the fuel tank and braced himself carefully. The round he had loaded into his anti-material rifle was tremendously explosive all on its own, and every shot from the nearly 6-foot-long weapon kicked like an Ogryn's Ripper gun. He was lying flat against the ground, his rappel ropes pooled around him. But thanks be to the Founder, who bestows on us victory through our Lord Leto the God Emperor. The Calambian whispered to himself the words of the Akasha.
Okay, so the Emperor's name is not Leto, okay? Many Imperial worlds have different ways of expressing the faith. They wouldn't do it for long around Sisters of Battle, but several will view the Emperor in a different way. They might have names for him, things like that. This one apparently does.
A calming salve on his sizzling nerves. He had been tasked with coming to this place with his spotter, who had fallen to his death as they had scaled the side of the massive park platform. But it was not the death of his friend which had him so shaken. He'd grieve later. He'd have to. It also wasn't the knowledge that, if he got careless, his gun's recoil could kick him off the ledge, or even that his shots would be visible and loud, drawing all of the enemy's attention to his admittedly distant location. It was that his shot would signal the start of Major Lazarus's plan. that at the sound of his gun, the rest of the Colombian patriots would begin their last-ditch effort to destroy the sniper tanks and secure some kind of evac from the devils barking orders back at high command. He'd never had so much responsibility heaped onto him, never been so crucial in the start of an operation, not like this at least. Were they all in place, all ready for the mission to begin? He checked his chrono and clenched his teeth. The allotted time had come and was rapidly passing. The combined survivors at the bridge were, even then, doing all they could to hold the bulk of the enemy's attention. Joseph steeled himself, leaning into his rifle. He would simply need to have faith that directly across the vast distance to the opposite side of the park platform, his brothers and sisters in arms were ready, hanging by their own rappels, prepared to come over the lip, guns blazing.
Wow.
Oh, Death, where is your sting? He asked his rifle. The man squeezed a nearly numb finger around the gun's warm trigger, and his weapon loyally answered the question with a single, thundering shout.
Oh, that's bad.
It spoke the language of ruin, of annihilation and finality, its breath the exhalation of death's response. Here, spoke the rifle, and in its wake, the Reaper did sing.
Meanwhile,
Death was everywhere, raining in and around them in all its various forms. The Replique soldiers had blown down most of the Imperial barricades, but had found their intended massacre stifled by the deep trenches the Kriegers had edged out of the false earth of the park. Cadians, Kriegers, and all others who had managed to survive this long, crowded shoulder to shoulder with comrades and corpses, guns bristling from their jagged trench lines. The Republic's toy soldiers had been set on pelting them from a distance, but after seeing how ineffective this was and feeling how hard Imperial munitions could punch back, had chosen to roll over them in a rush of bodies and blasters instead. The troopers were infuriated, roaring in their helmets as they closed in, blasters blazing blue like neutron stars. Initially, all 13 had been able to manage was to jam himself between Julian
13,
and Emiliana,
my boy!
single arm thrust out with his hell pistol held aloft. From that position, he had managed to fell 3 of the incoming Replique before a blue bolt took him in the face. The glancing shot sufficient to knock him from the line and out of the waking world. For a time, a long time, or a brief time, there was simply cool, calm, nothing.
oh my God.
No cares, no compulsions, no thoughts at all. And then, searing pain paired with the touch of life. 13 gasped, dragging fresh air into his lungs and almost screaming it out right away. He tried to rise, tried to bring his hand up to his burning face, but was held down. Through the haze of his pain, he barely made out Jackna's face, her violet eyes staring down into his. She yanked a syringe out of his chest, and he barely felt the spine-chilling sensation through the agony racking his face. He could feel the cold air and rain on his skin and against his wound, ripping screams out of his mouth. "Hold still! Damn it, 13! Hold still! You're going to lose a whole lot more than your eye!" She yelled through the din of battle and his own voice. He registered her order, clamping his teeth shut almost over his tongue and groaning beneath her, trying to go limp to let her work. The ground trembled as explosives went off near their trench, Jackna covering his face with her body and shielding him from the rain of mud and blood which followed, before backing off and continuing the work. His fingers dug into the churned, wet soil, toes flexing and clawing the insides of his boots as she worked over his ruined eye with surgical gear, each snipped and cut sending flashes up the skull and pain into his very soul. He almost wished she'd just kill him instead and allow him to return to nothing. But something in him kept the desire from being quite as genuine as it would have been before. Though it felt like an eternity, Jackna finally concluded her work, flicking away a bloody ball of something 13 tried not to think about, before using some kind of spray on the burnt parts of his face. Right away he sighed, twitching limbs easing up and going still, letting him catch his breath and recover for a brief time as she wrapped her work in bandages, tying them off tightly. My gun, 13 muttered as she pulled away. The medic frowned for a moment, as if she did not quite understand him, before she made sense of his words and laughed, taking a moment to fish the pistol from some place beside her. She didn't hand it to him, instead sliding it into the holster at his side. "Don't move, you plank," she told him. "You're barely holding together, and I doubt your heart can take another stim of any kind. Just sit tight and try not to get shot anymore." She had started to say, but as she did, 13 saw something terrible. Above her, he could see the lip of their trench, and standing there, having just arrived, was a replique of the Republic, shouldering its gun and preparing to fire. He reacted without thinking, grabbing Jackna by the arm and throwing her away as he rolled. The enemy trooper fired, catching the medic's left arm instead of her back.
Bastard.
The shot hit dead on, and the woman screamed as the unguarded limb was blown clean off. She curled around the stump of her lost arm, going still shortly after, and 13 knew not if she had died from shock or merely lost consciousness, and he had no time to find out. He rolled in the mud, fumbling to draw his returned firearm, but not managing to pull it free before the Republic trooper had sighted him and fired. The trooper only scored a near miss, as its shoulder and most of the back of its head were blown into a red rain by a close-quarters blast from Julian's shotgun. 13 was grateful, but there was not even a moment for a brief thanks as more of the replique arrived at the lip, firing down all along the line. Julian discharged his shotgun into another clone looming over them, and 13, pistol now in his hands again, covered him by lancing 2 holes in another soldier that was attempting the very same thing on Julian. When a third warrior emerged from the raining gloom of their trench line, the Cadian greeted it with an empty shotgun, pitched right into its face. 13 finished that one as well, putting 3 holes in its chest, but not before it tossed a present of its own into their trench, a grenade. Julian dove to the ground, scrambling for it and grasping it with cold hands. He rose and reared high to pitch the damn thing when it went off.
Damn it!
Still clutched in his hand. Julian's body seemed to pop, smearing his blood, bones, and armor across the trench, and only narrowly avoiding 13, who was already on the ground. His head was ringing from the pressure of the blast, and he could barely make out what was happening around him with his one remaining eye. Was Emiliana still alive? Was anyone? He groaned, feeling the rain washing the mud and blood off of his face and bandages as he rose to his feet, feeling more than hearing the thump beside him as someone jumped down into the trench. The Imperial spun, ducking and narrowly avoiding the swung butt of a clone rifle, planting his knees into the ground as he pressed the steel end of his hell pistol into the replique's chest, and fired, creating holes in the enemy soldier. But it was not the only one. 13 spun again, pressing himself against the side of the trench and barely avoiding a cascading line of death issued by a minigun-wielding replique. The plasma weapon spat out a volley of fast bolts, scything down the trench and killing more guardsmen. 13 waited for the blaster fire to pass before leaning out, extending his one good arm to fire, and pulled the trigger. Yet his shot sailed through empty air without connecting, sent wide as another clone dove down into the trench, catching his arm and wrestling 13 down to the ground. The Krieger kicked and struggled, grunting and gritting his teeth as the clone elbowed him in the face and forced open his hand. 13 panted, kneeing the replique's armored torso again and again, but getting nowhere and feeling a pit open in his stomach as his gun was forced from his fingers. The replique trooper tossed away its own cumbersome rifle, drawing its own blaster pistol as it continued to wrestle with the Krieger. 13 fought hard, but was one-armed and wounded, leaving him in a distinct disadvantage that the Republic soldier was quick to make use of.
Distinct.
The replique shoved its blaster pistol almost into 13's mouth before it was kicked off of him, T-visor shattering against Gregor's boot. The big man shot the enemy a few times with his lasgun and reached down, grasping the Krieger by his collar and lifting him up without apparent effort, pinning him to the wall briefly as he set the soldier upright. "Come on, kid!" he barked, having no more time to speak as he hefted his lasgun up and opened up a spray of fire, catching the minigunner just as it had begun to sweep its weapon back down towards their direction. The clone screamed and fell, body smoking as it landed atop a pile of others 2 men deep. As this was happening, Replique soldiers from behind them opened fire, cracking and shattering the flak armor Gregor wore and scorching his body
Damn
badly.
it!
But the huge Cadian did not drop.
For the Emperor!
He bellowed, staggering around and leaning against the muddy wall as he loosed his fire against them, the scattering shots less than accurate, yet the cover and the trench affording the Republic troops little options for escape. Blue shots punched into Gregor again and again, but the man only slumped down to a sitting position once the 2 clones before him had dropped. The third managing to scramble back up and out of the trench before he followed suit. The young Krieger watched it all, mud flowing over the sides of the pits they were fighting in and streaming thickly over his arms and neck. Looking on, he could see the big man was breathing raggedly and bleeding from several wounds that 13 guessed were or would be lethal. Still, he couldn't
Damn
stop
it.
himself from coming to the Cadian's defense as another clone leapt over the lip and began firing. 13 yelled, running with all the might he had left as the Replique soldier turned to face him. Feeling the long barrel of the blaster skipping and sliding along the armor on his shoulder before he impacted the trooper and slammed it into the opposite wall. They grappled, and the Krieger realized he would need help to overcome the hand-to-hand advantage the enemy had over him.
Yeah.
Doing what he could with one arm, he eventually found that help in the form of a rigid handle pressed against the back of his arm, which was wrapped around the torso of the Republic soldier. A shovel! One of the tools
Yes!
used to carve out the trench. Left here in the hip.
Yes! Yes! The Republic is fucked! A Krieger has a shovel!
Haste it had taken to get ready for the battle. Now, his. He loosened his grip on the enemy to grab the handle, and the trooper kicked him off in response. Instead of resisting the blow, the Krieger rolled with it, spinning as he drew the digging instrument out from behind the Replique's back and slashed it across the clone's eyes, shattering the visor there. 13's back hit the muddy wall with a splat, the wet earth sucking and squelching as he pulled himself back off, single arm raised. The Replique fell back, clutching its wounded eyes, and never rose again as 13 leapt atop him, shovel rising and falling as the Imperial hacked the clone to pieces. He would have kept hacking till his arm lost its strength, but 13 caught movement from the corner of his eye and spun. Instinct dominating his every action as he threw the shovel end over end. That saved him from the first trooper, but not the second, who shot twice, narrowly missing him as he jumped against the opposite wall. But there was nowhere to hide, and his maneuver would have done little more than purchase seconds, were it not for the beams of light which pierced the clone's head, dropping the trooper to the ground. 13 panted hard, looking around for where the shots had come from, and taking several moments to spot the collapsed form of Emiliana. Half buried in liquid dirt, her rifle cradled in her right arm, his hell pistol clutched in her left hand. Both barrels hot and smoking. She was gasping as well, and clearly wounded, though it was hard to tell how badly. The bare-faced Krieger staggered to her and bent down to help her up, offering his hand. She grinned with a wince at the gesture, though Emiliana pushed his pistol back into his hand instead of taking it. "Guard up, 13, said the corporal, voice pained. He nodded and took the weapon, and no sooner had he that he felt a hard shot crash into the back of his shoulder, smashing the flak plate there and burning his chemically treated coat. He fell face first into the mud and spun, both he and Emiliana aiming their weapons up and firing at the 3 new clones who leered into their trench. After a few tense seconds of exchanged fire, one of the Replique died and the other 2 retreated away, tossing a grenade into their wake.
Oh, nice.
The corporal sucked in a breath, but 13 acted without hesitation, sweeping his leg and kicking the round explosive into a pile of corpses several feet to their right. The 2 covered their heads and braced as the thing detonated, showering them in more blood and viscera, but
Nice.
otherwise not harming either. They snapped their guns up, ears ringing, almost bleeding, and waited, listening to the rain falling, battle sounding all around them. Yet, as time dragged itself by, nothing more came for them. The two looked at each other and realized that the only sound they could hear consistently after a time was the sound of the rain. Gradually, 13 picked himself up, careful not to slip, and, with great trepidation, peeked up with his one good eye, looking over the lip of the trench. Nothing but rain and mud. "Where are they?" asked Emiliana, still laying on the ground. "Gone," said 13, turning back towards her and kneeling, holstering his gun as he began to try to help her get up to her feet. The Cadian grit her teeth and hissed, but did slowly rise, leaning against the Krieger heavily. "Gregor," she croaked through a hoarse throat. No response. "Gregor!" she yelled more loudly. "Frick! I'm still alive, Corporal." He groaned from nearby. "Jackness, here, not moving." He managed to add, sounding not much better than dead. "Save your breath," Emiliana said, looking around for the rest of her squad. "Where'd they go?" she asked softly, referring to the enemy. 13 shrugged a little, ambling next to her as they began to gather the survivors near them and put down the replicate who yet lived. At first, it seemed baffling, their sudden absence, the quiet. But slowly, 13 started to pick up on fainter sounds and realized the most probable explanation as he did. "The Major," 13 said. "Huh?" asked the Cadian beside him. "It must be the Major," he said. She paused, listened, and then nodded, flashing a pained grin. "You must be right."
My system wants to argue with me today.
Lazarus would rather go round 2 with Rejulia, or request a transfer from Indricta than be where he was now. The wind tugged and teased, sometimes weak and sometimes making him feel like a plucked spider clinging onto a single string. The only reason he was here now, the one thing he wouldn't do, was let his men down. Technically, all the soldiers under his new command were his men, but Lazarus had been the head of a squad prior to his insane elevation, and those men were truly his brothers. Even as the wind tore at him, tempting his adhering boots to release the metal surface he walked on, he would not let them down. Even as he felt brand new sensations of fear and dread poking holes in his nerves, his arms kept reeling in the rappel line, feeding it into his winding belt spool. Even as he reached the position just below the lip of the platform, belt-mounted rope and magnetic soles holding him tenuously in place as he and several thousand Calambian patriots unslung various weapons, he did not falter. At least not too much. The former sergeant bunched the muscles in his neck, keeping his eyes fixed upwards towards the gray, raining sky. His goggles kept the water out of his eyes, but obscured the shifting, indistinct forms of the clouds and made blurry the rigid, silver towers reaching for them from the edges of his vision. As little as that view provided for him, it was leagues better than looking down and awakening within himself that foregone fear which struck him whenever he found himself gazing into a far-flung abyss. "Major! Hey, Major!" called one of the men around him, a thickly set man hefting a sniper rifle. Lazarus craned his neck to look at the corporal, only realizing the mistake of his instinct when the corner of his eye skimmed the drop below them, and just after he centered his vision on the soldier's shit-eating grin. His wounds, and particularly his freshly applied cybernetics, ached badly and ate away at his typical patience. The metal arm had been hastily grafted onto him by a cavalcade of tech priest survivors. While he was grateful to have the use of his burnt and now amputated arm back in his service, the trauma of the loss and the constant deep pain the sedated wound assaulted him with was another one of those things he was trying not to think about. Glaring, he locked eyes with his former corporal.
The system's fighting me today, guys. It's fighting me hard.
Damn you, Jackson! You better have a good reason for getting my attention! Lazarus barked, keeping his voice from veering into a higher than dignified pitch, though only by a few scant octaves. Sure do, Major, said the man. I understand the part of the plan that gets us here, behind the enemy while their cocks are swinging. I get that we gotta take down all their limping tanks to secure evac. But what I don't get is, how we're even gonna get to evac when we mop them up? That main force is gonna swing around for us, tanks or no tanks, and unless we plan to jump over the ledge, I don't see where we can pull back to. Lazarus grimaced. He knew his plan wasn't foolproof, and even though he had tried to account for this specific problem in particular, he really hoped he would not be forced to resort to it, or any other tactics more desperate and unconventional than the one he was going to execute now. We gotta have faith that the flyboys cover us when it counts, Corporal. Stay Gumby. The Major said back, eyes aimed skyward once more. So, in other words, we're properly fucked whether we win or lose, the man said back sarcastically. Suck it up, Jackson. Whole platoon knows you've been proper fucked ever since the sisters caught you listening to Talik, said another soldier hanging nearby, just close enough to not have to yell
alive?
to be heard. Lazarus couldn't see Jackson's reaction to the barb, but he could hear the soft chuckling all around them and couldn't help but grin, particularly when the offended corporal snapped back. Empire Spire does not play Talik music. You can't call literally anything played on a skier flute Talik, otherwise you're just surrendering the whole genre to fucking Xenos. Hey, Jackson, how would you like to join me and get saddled with a moonbeam for the duration of our time on this planet, Corporal? Lazarus asked, cutting the man off before he got too loud. He didn't see it, but Jackson shut right up, even his fresh blush washing off at the words, which he did not return. That's what I thought. That goes for the rest of you too. No more mouthing. Operation could begin any second, and it needs to come out neat and tidy if anyone is coming out of this in one piece. Regiments on the bridge are bleeding to hold the enemy's attention. We've got to make that sacrifice count. Har? Har. 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 The soldiers around him said back, falling into grim silence afterwards, broken only intermittently by light chatter. And that didn't last long. Soon they all heard it, the sound of an anti-material rifle loosing its deadly shot, and then the deafening, roaring boom of a fiery explosion.
Nice.
Lazarus knew he could trust the officers under him to keep the men on time and in sync with the plan. But he couldn't help ordering the advance aloud in spite of that. Kill, he said, heedless of the fact that his Vox speed was silent, as were all the others turned off as a precaution to keep the enemy from detecting them. Captains and sergeants repeated the order all throughout the hanging line of readied soldiers. And as one, they activated their rappel spools, causing them to reel in hard and fast, almost tossing the men over the lip of the platform. As planned, the snipers and their spotters hit the dirt and set up, as did the heavy weapons teams, aided by the few tech priests that had accompanied them. The other advancing fire teams began to divide, racing forward as they sprinted to close the distance. As Lazarus had hoped, the loud shot and explosion had drawn all eyes and focus away from the rear of the replique's column. This bought vital seconds he and the other Calambians spent rushing for all they were worth, angling for cover and veering out of what would soon become a lethal crossfire. As soon as he slid to a stop behind a disordered stack of discarded trees, he saw the telltale blue shots that signaled that they had been spotted. Before the blue bolts could even reach their resting points, the snipers and heavy weapons teams opened up, creating thunder and flashes which could shame lightning as they tore into the rear lines of the replique. Heavy stubbers, autocannons, Calambian chain guns, bolters, and a few heavy bolters trailed lines of thick projectile fire into the men and vehicles of the Republic. ripping bodies to shreds and blowing over a few of the walkers in just the opening volley. On top of that, though they were still somewhat distant, the fire teams began to pick targets, engaging with bursts of automatic and semi-automatic fire as they continued their advance, Lazarus leading their way near the front. He had half hoped that the chaos caused by their surprise assault would be enough to force a rout, or at least to keep them stumbling while they did their work. But the damned toy soldiers were clearly veterans, and they didn't scare easy. Even then, they were regrouping and beginning to counterattack. But they had made a fatal flaw, one which the Imperium now fully exploited. The replica commander had assumed that the enemy lay trapped before him, and so had marched out with most of his forces. Though he had not been so foolhardy as to leave no defense behind, those troopers he had left were armed with almost exclusively flamethrowers, as Lazarus' scouting servo skulls had reported. The replicae ran around the flaming wreckage and burnt corpses of the few felled sniper tanks and the remains of the fuel tank, raising nozzles as they advanced. Lazarus raised his fist, and his command to hold and hunker down was relayed across the squads in short order. They waited, hitting the dirt or finding cover wherever they had to, until at last the first of the replicae came into effective range. Effective range of the rifles, not their own flamethrowers. Rigid, white and yellow in the darkness and carrying explosive fuel tanks, the replicae quickly found themselves choking on bullets before long. Their pale, shell-like armor, though powerful enough to deflect some shrapnel, was far from sufficient to stop blessed Calambian rounds, cracking and bursting like civilian ceramics before the weighty touch of a hammer. The replicae yelled into their bucket-like helmets, charging through the rain of death, but precious few survived the harrowing hails of lead long enough to come into effective range of their flamethrowers. Those that unleashed their lethal torrents of fire took grim satisfaction in hearing the screams of the Calambians they'd reached. But their pained deaths were cold comforts, for the Patriots had spread out as a matter of habit, greatly reducing the effectiveness of the Republic flamers' spread. A few of the replicae managed to form pockets of entrenched resistance, but as holes were rent into their wider formations, the Calambians flowed in and around the defenders, boxing the troopers in and moving behind them. Lazarus surveyed the battlefield as best he could, activating his Vox speed and hearing the reports and chatter coming in from the other Calambian fighters. He was dissatisfied with how many of the men were getting hung up on those pockets of resistance, particularly given their initial advantage, but there was nothing for it. He snapped a few orders into his Vox channel, having the Patriots encircle and hammer their positions while he and the rest of the men prepared to assault the tanks. The Imperial fire support was running low on ammunition, the majority of their stockpiles having been left below to enable the rapid ascent of the heavy weapons teams on their rappel lines. Even so, they had thrashed the artillery column wickedly, and as their thundering began to die down, the advancing Patriots pushed harder, knowing that the completion of the task now fell to them. In relatively short order, the Calambians had crossed most of the way to the column. A hissed report from one of the snipers informed Lazarus that the main body of the Republic forces was starting to attempt a haphazard disengagement, presumably having noticed the ambush. It didn't matter, he knew. The toy soldiers would come back running at full speed, and they would still never reach his men in time to save their precious limping tanks. He dashed across slurries of dirt and mud, boots sucking and thumping, the rain making everything gray and hazy. Lightning and air power lit the shrouded skies with brief, bright flashes. Spinning, tumbling wrecks of dying war machines fell from the weeping void above, trailing flames like falling torches. Their impacts rattled the platform, spreading promethium fires across the scorched park grounds, though nowhere close to the Major himself. Ahead of him, the silhouettes of the sniper tanks, both those still standing and those which had fallen, became clearer and clearer, lit both by the flames coating the wreckage of the latter and the vicious gleam of the continuous artillery fire of the former. He ducked and wove around 2 bright blue bolts and went aground, sliding in the dirt and coming to rest behind a pair of horse corpses, the remains of some of the earlier Rough Riders. The blue bolts belted and jostled the heavy, augmented cadavers, but the former mounts held their integrity for now. Ignoring the vicious throbbing of his wounds, Lazarus waved 2 fire teams over toward his position, radioing them to send their heavy armaments. Moments later, 3 Calambians with missile tubes had made their way over to him. "What pattern are those weapons?" Lazarus asked them, his back pressed tightly against the cold carcasses that made up his cover. "Tread feathers," said one, a woman with blonde hair streaked over her face and between her eyes. "Tread what?" Lazarus asked, taking a moment to pop up, using his last pistol to send a few lances of light toward the enemy just to keep their heads down. "Tread feathers," she repeated, unslinging the compact launcher and presenting it as if to show it off. She certainly seemed smug enough about it. "Lightest guided launchers in the fleet," she said proudly. "Stole a whole crate full of them from..." she began. "Shut it! I don't want to know! Those slims loaded with crack missiles?" the Major snapped. The Patriot pulled her weapon back towards her and grinned broadly. "Har, just as ordered. Outstanding! Take your shots. I want each of you to take aim at the 3rd leg of one of those limping tanks. Knock the big steel bastards over," Lazarus ordered. "Yes, sir," she said before proceeding to take a knee along with the 2 others, bracing their weapons and aiming carefully. Lazarus and his immediate squad poked over their makeshift barricade and opened fire, covering the 3 Calambians as they lined up their shots. "3 made-to-order metal circumcisions on the way!"
Oh, damn!
shouted the launcher-bearing Calambian. Smoke, fire, and buckling steel followed the jibe, and one by one, the formidable 3-legged tanks of the Republic began to topple and burn.
All right. I've never heard of that terminology before, like a missile launcher being a circumcision. That's a new one. Shit. I love his way of getting me to care about characters. I'm like totally invested in. I'm shipping 13 and the Cadian. I'm shipping them. I don't care. So, now he is young. Never mind on that one. But, I don't want them to die. I don't want these people to die. Somebody's gotta die, though. A lot of people are gotta die. That's 40K versus Star Wars. In any case, this continues to be fun to listen to. This continues to be fun to pay attention to. I'm loving everything about this. If that guy who had been playing the Taoish music had been in my regiment, we would have had a bad day. In any case, I'll catch you guys for the next one. Episode 21 is going to be right around the corner. Oh, now it doesn't want to turn off. Go figure.